All right. Well, that was a great first panel, and thinking about things like adaptability, technology, building relationships, communicating are all important things for us as professors to think about as we build our law classes of the future. And so now we're going to talk about how we get started, how we become the law school of the future. And to that end, I have 6 panelists who contributed chapters to the book to talk about, we're going to do this again in a Q&A format, so to answer some questions about how we become that law school of the future. I am just going to give brief introductions because the full bios are on the website. So we have Rachel Smith from St. John's University School of Law. Hi, Rachel. It's so funny, for so many of you, this is the first time we're actually meeting face to face, which is a little surreal in some instance. I have Meredith Stange from Northern Illinois University College of Law. Meredith. We have another Rachel Krosky Roberts from UC Irvine School of Law. We'll be there for, I think, Allwood in a few years, right? This is exciting. We have Nyla Millar from Delaware Law School, Susan Landrum from Nova Southeastern University, and then Stephen Rosenbaum from UC Berkeley.
Hi.
All right, so let's get started. I want to ask first, and we've got Rachel Smith answering this question, how online law teaching was viewed at your institution before the pandemic?
Hi, thank you so much for having me and for that question. I was racking my brain for a metaphor for how to describe how my law school in particular, and maybe the wider university, saw online law teaching. And then I realized that really the pandemic is its own metaphor, which is that there was a whole bunch of technology, a whole bunch of preparation in place, and really no one knew what to do or how to use it. And the university had WebEx. We had plenty of technological options. We had, the ability to record classes from in the building, from your own computer. We had places to upload them. But really, we were not using them. We were still doing the kind of classic, like we were in New York and we had snow days. And then you would have a snow day and then you would do an in-person makeup class. And there would be this scuffle at the end of the semester to reserve the biggest rooms for the makeup classes on the few available days. Even though we had WebEx, we had all these things, we weren't doing that. And the university had online programs. The law school was looking into building out some maybe online degree programs right as this all happened in early 2020, but we weren't really using them. And what I think is sort of fascinating is that there were so many possibilities. There were so many strategies, right, to use the language of the book, that we could have been employing and that we had access to, that we had people who used them. We had instructional designers at the university. All this stuff existed. There was even an online essentials teaching course that almost no one at the law school had taken that is offered by the university. And I thought it was both good that we had all this stuff so that we could, right, get this learning going quite quickly and sort of tap into all of these things when we needed them. But it seems strange now to think, why were we so not using any of the tools and things that we had available? Why had we not taken that leap to sort of think creatively about using them before a crisis? And I guess it's that it's hard to sort of imagine things beyond your experience, in that, as much as there's been discussion in law school teaching about online programs, for schools that hadn't done them or needed them yet, it wasn't a pressing concern. And so I think that the question we have to ask ourselves going forward all the time is, what is the next thing like this, right? That we can be ahead of instead of, not ahead of, I guess is the best way to say it.
Yeah, and that's certainly some of what Katie was talking at the end of the last panel about being adaptable and teaching our students to adapt. At the University of Arizona, as I mentioned a little bit in my intro of Dean Miller, we were open to online teaching, and we were just getting our feet wet in building online JD programs. And in fact, I had agreed to create an asynchronous constitutional law 2 course I had agreed, I think in fall of 2019, I was in the process of starting, I was just about to get into the studio to start recording it in March of 2020. And then all of a sudden I had to record all of the lectures, from my home office. And so it was sort of a, wow, this is a lot different of an online course than I thought that I was creating. But it was that experience of creating a planned online course versus the emergency remote teaching that I was doing in my other classes that made me realize what a gulf there was between what we were doing day to day and what I was planning for my summer, asynchronous course. Um, so hindsight is always 2020. And our next question is if you could go back in time to March 2020, which seems so long ago, what is the one piece of advice about moving online that you would give to either yourself or to your law school to help in that process now, almost a year and a half later? Nyla, why don't you start us off?
Yeah, so hi, and thanks for having me. I'm excited to be here and I'm excited about the book. So my perspective on these questions is really driven by my interest in health and well-being and how to make law practice and how to make legal education a more healthy and humane place. And so not surprisingly, my chapter in the book is on digital wellness, which is this idea of how can we use technology, which we have to, right? We already did before the pandemic and we're doing it even more now. But how can we use it in a way that's healthy, in a way that's mindful? And what I found in my research as I was writing the chapter was that there's a lot of potentially harmful effects on our physical and our mental health. And I saw that with my students. I think the pandemic itself had an impact on mental health, but I think also just being, separated, being at home, being on a screen all day, like they just seemed much more depressed to me. I don't think it helped with their anxiety, which was already high. I just saw a lot of that from them. And so, and from us too, we were not immune. But so what my thought on this experience was, how can we make, legal education and law practice gentler, more humane and healthier overall. And so that was sort of that's been my guiding principle and how I've been thinking about it. And some of the things I did to help and that I'll continue doing, one was offering students more positive feedback and more encouragement. So being really deliberate, and I've always done, here's what you did well and here's what you need to work on. But my here's what you did well section got bigger. And it just, I really wanted to pull out, this, I could see you were trying so hard on this. I could see you worked, you took this into consideration, really just tried to be somewhat more creative and more appreciative of their work. It also meant taking into consideration students' life circumstances a little bit more. So really, and I think I've always sort of been more on the side of, understanding when life stuff came up, but really trying to be open to working with them. A lot of them had caregiving responsibilities and, things going on at home that were really tough. So just sort of, again, being more open to that and being, having more of a dialogue with them about those sorts of things. It meant for me using more humor and levity. Humor is really helpful. Laughing is great for reducing anxiety and stress. And so the more we could just be a little silly sometimes and like, oh, your cat just, your cat's, butt was just on the screen or whatever, like that just happened. So the more we could just laugh about it together, I felt like was helpful for connection and helpful for reducing stress. I also shared with them, there's a great, it's based in DC, but there's this wonderful meditation place and they were offering free online meditation every day of the week. And I just said, please guys, just go try this, just do it and why not? So just sharing with them resources and tools that would be useful for them in dealing with some of these issues. And then for myself, as well as for them, but for me, it really meant, thinking about boundaries, creating boundaries around work and personal time and family time and all those different components, being really intentional around that and also enforcing, because I'm sure as some of you experienced that, especially when you get online or in sort of a non-traditional classroom sort of situation, those lines get a little blurry. And so I thought both, it was good for me, but it was also good to model for my students. Like at some point you close your books and then you're just you again, and you get to have some time to do things you enjoy, right? So overall, there's probably a million different things I would go back and, tell myself before this all happened. But I think it reinforced my idea that we can make legal ed and law practice a healthier and more humane place. So thank you.
Great, thank you, Nyla. Rachel Smith, what would be your one piece of advice going back to your or your right at COVID start self?
So my piece of advice, and this connects directly to the chapter I wrote with our head law librarian, Courtney Selby, who's really the greatest, but was that take this as an opportunity to really facilitate and encourage discussions among faculty about teaching. That this was a kind of unprecedented opportunity to have the entire law faculty, adjunct professors, contract skills professors, tenure track professors, tenured professors, really together focus their energies on what are the best choices to make when teaching in this new way, and to use it for a bunch of reasons, that kind of faculty-led approach. One is to build the social bonds of the faculty during this incredibly isolating and lonely time. Of course, we all know, especially if you have children or sort of intense pets like I do, that you were both very with people in your house, if you have people or animals in your house, but then also very alone when it came to your work. And so that was a really nice way to facilitate these conversations, was a really nice way to continue to build bonds among the faculty and social bonds during this lonely time. Also, law schools can get very focused on scholarship, and it was nice to have an opportunity to reorient everyone back to the mission of good teaching and excellent teaching. I also liked how student focused our discussions were, like really trying to think again about what our students need, and in a new way, what our students needed in this very uncharted environment where they were all over the country really for the first time, where they were sometimes sick, sometimes helping sick family members, just all of the ways that made us reconsider the needs of our students. In the same way too, there's an opportunity to innovate in our teaching, and certainly in the faculty, there were people who were constantly innovating before the pandemic, and then there were many who weren't, right? And so figuring out what that means for cold calling, what does that mean for exam-only courses, right? Starting to talk to even people who had taught property or contracts or Civ Pro the same way for decades. Well, how could you build in some low-stakes formative assessment? How can you think differently about how you call on students or use Socratic techniques? Was really exciting. And for me, as a legal writing professor, one thing I loved about it is that it was a chance to really flip-flop the question of expertise when it came to teaching. And it seemed that there were skills faculty who had a lot to offer and had the sort of attention of the broader faculty and the administration because of their expertise and being attuned to their students in that way. And so really, I loved it for this reason, which is that the faculty got to come together and really think and work on teaching. And I think it made our teaching better, it made our morale better, it helped our students. And so that's my big piece of advice that I would have given myself.
And I think that goes right in line with the question we have in the Q&A about colleagues who say, law school is different, it can't be done online, the Socratic method can't be replicated. And I think COVID and some of the work that's been done pre-COVID makes us really think, well, is the Socratic method the best way for teaching our law students, or the only way, certainly, for teaching our law students? Meredith, what's your piece of advice?
Well, actually, that dovetails quite nicely to my piece of advice, which is you can't recreate the in-person classroom online. That was my big thing. I spent a ridiculous amount of time when we first shifted to online saying, I've been teaching for nearly 20 years. I can do this. I'll be able to recreate the in-person learning experience and it'll be great. It'll be just like it was. I'll be able to show that it can be just like in person, but online. And it can't be. That doesn't mean it's bad, but it can't be. And so I spent an awful lot of time, I know for myself, and I know other colleagues did as well, and I'm sure you all know this as well, a lot of time fighting against the online format and getting very frustrated when it wasn't exactly like in person. And I didn't require students to have their cameras on because I knew some of them were in their bedrooms, and I don't need to be in my students' bedrooms. They don't need to be in my bedrooms. Let's just have a line. And so I definitely didn't do that. And so I couldn't see them and I couldn't see the faces when they were confused and frustrated. And that's the one thing that I would say to myself, is just cut yourself some slack, because that is definitely the theme of my chapter. But don't fight against the online format. There are some great things you can do in online teaching that don't necessarily translate to in person. I feel like I was a much more relaxed, as Nyla said, a funnier teacher online. Not that I've ever been a particularly staid or stodgy teacher, but I felt like I, in order to engage my students, I was much more relaxed. I was much more casual than I normally am in person. For example, in my health law class this summer, when people don't talk, I will actually dance. I will do this because they can only see me from like this up. So I was like, guys, I'm just going to keep dancing until someone says something. And it cracks them up and they'll start to talk. And that, I think, is something that I never would have done in person and I never would have thought to do in person. So not fighting the online format, I think, is really, really key, and kind of embracing it and accepting there's going to be ups and downs. You're learning a new way to teach, but it's not necessarily bad. And you're learning new things about yourself as a teacher that you might not have ever learned if you hadn't shifted to online.
That's great. The dancing is great. I would joke with my students if they didn't turn on their camera that I at least washed my hair for them. So the minimum they could do was turn on the camera for me to answer a question. Rachel Krosky Roberts, what would be your piece of advice?
Thank you so much for having me. So one of the downsides to coming forth in the list is that I'm finding that some of the things that I wanted to say, really Meredith said a lot of it, but I want to take it just from a slightly different angle, I guess, which is that I don't think I fought the online platform. The shift was so rapid for us. It was March 16th, and it was just like that, and I was terrified. And I think my one piece of advice, and coming out the other end of this, I had perhaps my most rewarding year of teaching ever during COVID. Probably my most effective year of teaching. And it was my 19th year of teaching, so it's not like it was, so I think my one piece of advice would be to take a deep breath and jump right in. Don't hesitate. Meredith is right, you can't fight, you can't recreate. I think that was my sort of thing that I realized was you do have to teach yourself everything there is to know about online pedagogy. It does require having kind of a novice spirit if you haven't done it in the past, to say, you know what, I may have been teaching forever, but now I'm new again. But that's exciting. I mean, that actually reinvigorated me and my teaching. And so, my advice to myself, and I pretty quickly realized you can't just shift what you would have done in the physical space online. There are two problems with it. First of all, it just doesn't work, right? So you can pretend, but it's going to be really bad. But then the other thing is, it's such a limiting idea. What I found was that the online space opened up worlds of new opportunities for engaging students and for providing effective formative assessment. And so, thinking in terms of just shifting the physical space online was just too limiting. And so treating the move online as a reimagining of what the educational experience can be for you and for your students rather than some sort of chore that you have to do or something that you have to work around, right? I found that, one of the panelists in the earlier panel mentioned doing continuing online feedback with young associates online. And one of the things I found worked so much better in the online environment was one-on-one conferences with my students. And so I don't think I'll ever go back to having them in my office, and they took more ownership of their own work. It was right in front of them. We could work on the document. Being just moving in without fear to see that it's a whole new world, but it's in many ways a better world. There are things that we can do. Like I had experts in my classroom from all over the country in a way that we never could have afforded had we tried to do that in the in-person space, trying to fly people in or something ridiculous. Like that seems ridiculous to me now that we would even consider that. My students learned from alums from across the country. So yeah, just jump in with no fear, but educate yourself because there's so much to learn.
The virtual experts has truly been a great part of Zoom, of bringing people in that you may not have a budget to fly them in. So I agree, that's a great part. Steve, what would be your one piece of advice to your March 2020 self?
Yeah, well, first, I want to use my 3 minutes to thank Tessa and Tracy for your foresight in this book and this conference, which is itself its own production. I mean, your management, your editorial attention. I haven't had someone edit my work so closely in a long time, and I loved it. Bringing us together for this, and yeah, even the way you moderate this panel, because there is a skill in moderation, in moderating. I think we know that. So I can't sing enough praises to you. And even that earlier panel of the judges and practitioners adds a really nice element. So I want to apologize for not having direct eye contact as I look at my notes here on another screen. I see Tracy's profile photo is great because it looks like there's someone who's there. But I guess there's 3 things I would say. One, planning and communication, and my colleagues here have said as much. And here I say, do as I say and not as I do. I tend to be a person who's more impromptu, juggling a lot, winging it. So it's so important to have that piece. And yet, as a number of folks have commented, we didn't have that, but now we do. So that's really important, communicating amongst ourselves and then to our various audiences, whether it's obviously students, other support people, guests. 2, disability access, which is something I didn't really emphasize much in my particular chapter. It really wasn't my mandate. And I'll talk a little bit about it later, but drawing on my own professional and personal experience, I think that's really key and something that we need to think about. We talk the talk in that, but don't always walk the walk, roll the roll on what it takes to really make something accessible from a disability standpoint. And third, I would say assuring the human component. And here I echo Nyla and I echo Rachel 1, Rachel 2, in terms of the assuring the human component is there. Nyla spoke a lot about students, Rachel Smith on the faculty and innovation, Rachel Krosky Roberts on the one-on-one and the availability of out-of-town guest speakers. I think that's great. On the human contact, this business, Tessa, I'm glad you were able to say to your students, take that camera off. That's such a very difficult conversation and policy debate to have, but those white letters on a black rectangle, sorry, Brian, it's nothing intended against you right now. It is difficult, particularly when there's a group presentation or students speaking and their camera's off. I get all the reasons for not having it. Disability access, personal space, all of that. Right, Meredith, don't want to be in your bedroom, don't want you, I'm in my bedroom now, you can see my bedroom. Anyway, so, but I'm not sure where I was going with that, but because of that, so much more important to have that human contact in ways we can. The humor piece, I think a number of folks, I don't know, Meredith talked about that, Rachel Krosky Roberts as well. I can be risky with my humor at times. My son would say, back when he was a teenager, flames, that was his line. He won't admit it now, but flames. And so sometimes that humor can go wrong. And when you don't have that ability to see your audience, to see that eye contact and the reaction, then, it's tricky. You got to watch it from harassment standpoints. You got to watch it from any standpoint. Sometimes I say the best thing to say is nothing. Okay, mute your cam, mute your video. But anyway, just one more point on the human contact. And I think a number of my colleagues have said this, checking in with students, faculty, peer, importance of that. The earlier panel talked about, judges talking to each other, the water cooler, which has been long gone, but what about that? We need to find ways to have that. And again, assuring student access, mental health. I think it might have been, I don't remember if Nyla spoke about that. Yeah, I guess that's your chapter. So anyway, those would, I share what my colleagues have said here, and I'm gonna mute myself right now.
I think the idea of personal space is such an interesting one, because during the pandemic, many of us were teaching from home, teaching remotely from home, and our students were certainly home or in other places. Now, an extended, a real embrace of online teaching could allow faculty to teach from an office or a studio on campus. But we struggled with this in our own house. We adopted a daughter during COVID, and so my home office became her bedroom, and I had to use a green screen because it was a hot mess in there for most of the year until we finally finished our current office. But certainly an extended, not emergency remote teaching would allow for law schools to be really deliberate about creating space for faculty to teach, and even maybe creating space for students to learn who have online classes but want to come to the law school physical building to do those classes. And that's something that we've thought about at the university. We have a few questions about disabilities, and I want to let you know that we are going to get to that. I have one more question, and then I see Susan is smiling because she's our resident expert on disability access. So we will get to that in just a second. But I'd like to talk first about what we've learned about ourselves. So our law school, our students, we had some really interesting chapters about dealing with students. So Susan, I'm going to start with you here. What did you learn about yourself during the move online that was surprising to you?
So I think for me, I think it's less about, what I learned was I've been teaching online for a very long time. I have been at least teaching in a hybrid format for over 20 years now, and taught my first entirely online law school class in 2013. So I had former students who, as soon as everyone moved online, they were on Facebook saying, "Hey, Dean Landrum, remember when you taught us back in this class, and your cat always was a guest instructor," and all of these things, right? So I'm used to that part of it. But I think because I didn't get to get into it as much regularly as what I might like to, I had forgotten about how fun it was, how much I enjoyed it, and how it really gave me this really huge creative space in which to work. And so, I mean, there are many things I hated about the pandemic, not the least being my wife had COVID and was very, very sick and things like that. But the fact that I got to dive into this again and really kind of remind myself of how much fun it is to go into a space where the rules shift and where you can do things that typically people don't expect you to do in a traditional classroom environment. And so I think that's probably the one thing. The other thing, though, it reminded me of that I'd forgotten because it had been so long since I had created a class from scratch that way, is how much time it is up front. Because I think when we teach a new class in the classroom, we distribute that time over the course of an entire semester differently. But when you want to teach online and you're putting so much, especially asynchronous content, into the learning management system up front, that front loads and compresses the work that you're doing in a way. And I've forgotten how much that was. So I think last summer I worked 80-hour weeks pretty regularly, just because, I mean, between that and the fact that we had a never-ending bar exam season. And I work with bar studiers as well. But you know, up front, it was a lot of work. I think if we were living in this space on a regular basis, however, we learn how to redistribute that work in more appropriate ways, right? We have more lead time before we're going to teach online, so we can spread that out more.
Sorry, I couldn't get to my unmute. The amount of work that it takes to teach online is truly, I think that was one of the things that surprised me the most. And it was hard to convey to people when, you know, there was requests for tuition reduction because of online teaching. I'm thinking, oh my goodness, I work way more. And then I need technology at home in addition to technology in the office. And so for sure, that's a great thing. Meredith, what did you learn about yourself that surprised you or your students?
I actually, and this sounds ridiculous, but I was surprised that my students were listening and paying attention. I think there is this feeling that, first of all, like I said, I wasn't requiring them to have their cameras on. And so there was this wall of like initials or random pictures, but also, you know, we've always heard that, oh, you know, students aren't going to be as engaged when they're online. You know, it's just like a course in a box and they're not really paying attention. And so when I had students who were incredibly, incredibly engaged, and I actually got to hear from students who wouldn't normally speak, and especially since we left in the middle of the semester, there were students who I had never heard speak who would either speak out audibly or write in the chat. And they were an incredibly engaged group, which to me was the biggest pleasant surprise, because we all had this, you know, idea about what online learning would be, and students won't be as engaged, they won't be paying attention, and they'll be doing other things. And I'm sure all of those things happened, but it also really opened the door for students who might not speak otherwise. They would type stuff in the chat and they would be able to speak out without speaking out. And I found that students were very engaged, and it made it much easier for me to feel like this was a real classroom, you know, not just a random, like I'm staring at the dot on my camera on my laptop. And so that was the biggest and most pleasant surprise for me, was that the students were still engaged, they were still interested in learning, and they were still making the class, you know, a really nice conversation.
Rachel Smith.
So what I would say surprised me was that my co-author and I chaired a faculty task force to come up with online teaching recommendations. And it met mostly last summer, the summer of 2020. And from the outset, that seemed like a hard ask to chair a task force with weekly meetings during this bizarre summer of the pandemic. And I was surprised both by how much I enjoyed the work, because I liked having weekly meetings. I liked seeing my colleagues and working together in a really positive and collaborative way. We came up with written recommendations ultimately that I'm quite proud of. And again, if you would have told me I would have enjoyed drafting a joint document with 9 of my colleagues over the summer of I would have been like, no, that's not possible. But I loved the teamwork and I loved that feeling. And it kind of carries over into the surprise about my students, which was I was so tired and remain so tired of my own face and looking at it all the time, that I continue to be shocked that my students want to see it and that they want to see our faces all the time. They're happy to have cocktail hours and coffee chats and social things and extra office hours and staying after class and logging in early. And it's just amazing to me that that has been a part of this, is both wanting to see my colleagues and my students wanting to see me.
All right, and Nyla.
Yeah, so one thing that surprised me a lot was how young my students are. So when I saw them in their parents' basements and in the laundry room and like with their old trophies behind them, and I was like, oh my God, they're babies. Like it was just really striking to me. I don't know, it just, that message had not been received so much on campus. And when I saw them in their settings, I was like, wow, they're so young. So it just made me think about development, you know, like the brain doesn't really stop developing until, you know, mid-20s. And so I've had students as young as 21, right? So I've had, you know, I definitely have plenty who are in that range. And so it just kind of made me think about, how we account for that, how we just take that into consideration in terms of expectations, in terms of how we develop our courses. I have one of my parenting philosophies for my own children is, set them up for success. So I don't expect my 5-year-old to sit quietly and still for a long period of time, for example, right? Like I just sort of want to set them up for being successful in different situations. With law students, I think keeping in mind that they are younger, that their brains are still developing, thinking about, attention spans and physical activity, thinking about making the lessons personal and relevant to them, making sure they have some buy-in there, really just kind of, I'm using a Game of Thrones example and I'm like, this is not, is this over now? Like, do I need to switch this up? And how will I figure that out? And then, keep competing for their attention a little bit. I think online, it really did feel like there's a lot going on in their computers that I don't know what that is. There's stuff going on around them in their home. There's stuff, their phone's probably nearby. I mean, it was just, there's a lot of distractions. And so knowing that that's just going to happen, we can say to them, turn off your phone and put it away and close all your screens, but like we have no, we have no way to enforce that. And so I think then it becomes, well, then you have them switch gears, you have them do something different. You have them go into a room, you have them stand up, you have them show you something, whatever it is to kind of keep them on point and really engaged as much as possible. They're not children, certainly, but they're young and they are developing and these are new skills they're, figuring out, right? So that was what I took away from that. Thanks.
Rachel Krosky Roberts' chapter actually talks a lot about some of the distractions that students face that you don't even think that they're facing, and that was really eye-opening to me. So let's move on to this discussion about not alienating groups of students when we move online. So even if we as faculty can potentially teach from our offices, not during pandemic situations, our students are going to be learning online from homes or other places. So how do we not leave behind students with disabilities, students who maybe are in low tech areas where they don't have quality internet access, or who don't have, 2 huge monitors and a tablet and a high class webcam and a Ring camera? So how do we bring those students together? And I'm going to start with Susan for this one.
Okay, and now we're getting into the area that I get really excited about, of course, because I really love working with students who have disabilities, but also students who are really coming from a whole variety of different backgrounds that are backgrounds we haven't typically seen represented in law school or in the profession, right? And that's the passion for what I do in my work really ties in very closely to that. For me, I'm going to separate this from the pandemic, because I think the problem is all of a sudden, all the pandemic did was it pulled away the layers of what already existed and that people were able to ignore before. We had students who had technology problems before. They didn't have Wi-Fi access. They didn't have appropriate technology at home. We've had students who have had disabilities all along. They just haven't had things given to them in accessible formats, because people thought they didn't have to do that when we had classrooms in the building that we were using instead. And in reality, we need to be applying this to everything that we do. If we put something online, it needs to be accessible. It doesn't matter if we're teaching online or not. And it should be accessible to everyone, not just to a select group or a couple of select groups of people. And so I'm a big proponent of universal design for learning. And for our purposes, I just want to talk about one principle that I think is really important, which is the principle of multiples. So the way I think about this is anything I do, I'm trying to look at it from multiple perspectives, right? Multiple approaches. And that would start with thinking about anything I put in line. Are there multiple ways for students to find it? I start off by, I map everything that I'm doing in my online learning management system. First, I have a giant whiteboard that covers one wall of my office. Whiteboard stickers from 3M, by the way. They pay me nothing to promote that, but I write all over the place, and I draw where the arrows so that I can see how people will access information. I link things in multiple places so everything is accessible to everyone in that kind of way. It means anything I put into that system, I want them to be able to access through multiple formats. That is my rule. I try a minimum of 2 formats, as many formats as I can think of, I want to create. If I'm doing a video, I want there to be closed captioning, and I want there to be a script. If I'm doing things in a digital format, I want to make sure that that is fully accessible through a text reader. If something has images, I want there to be descriptions of the images, alt text in a document, oral descriptions of anything that's on a slide that I'm doing in a video, etc. Right? So it's multiples. And I think about that, that makes a whole lot of sense when we think about people who have disabilities. But this is also important. I've worked a lot with students who are non-native English speakers. These same things make our materials more accessible for those students as well. Someone who wants to be able to study on the subway, they can access things differently because of that. If we think about students who are maybe spending some time waiting in a doctor's office, if we have things in multiple formats, they can access it more easily. And if I do something which is downloadable, so the student doesn't always have to be attached to Wi-Fi in order to access it, then that means that those students who maybe have more limited technology access at home have ways that they can access it without having the reliability of a Wi-Fi system constantly or things like that. So that's kind of my starting principle. There's a lot of other design principles that kind of intersect with that. I write about it a little bit in this chapter, and I've written about it in other formats as well. But that's, to me, at the heart of it, is this idea of multiple. As soon as I think of it in multiples, then I start making things accessible.
That's great. And then a lot of that is going back to what the earlier panel talked about, is learning the technology. And so, this is a minor thing, but I learned how to link things on our learning management system. And it's like, I've posted the document and I've linked it in your list of assignments, and just learning that, each little piece. I meet with our instructional designers, and I say, just teach a girl to fish, right? You teach me how to do it, I'll do it the next time, but I don't know how to do it the first time. Steve, you have dealt especially with low-tech individuals. So can you talk to us about how we move things online without alienating those groups?
Yeah, well, first, I want to compliment echo what Susan said. This is one of these instances of being siloed. I didn't realize there was a chapter on disability access, so that's great. And what you're saying, that this is stuff we should have been doing all along, and now it's become highlighted. And the non-English, limited English speaker, really good point, and that kind of segues to low tech. Let me also say what you said, Tessa, about learning oneself, of course, but take advantage of the facilities that are on campus at the law school, the various learning management platforms, which have gotten better and better on the disability access. My own experience has really been informed by teaching law students abroad in Egypt, Myanmar, where they have old school distance education, outdated textbooks. You come on campus for 2 weeks of cramming. That's a story in itself, as is Myanmar right now, Cambodia, and then later video conferencing with law students at University of Tehran and students in the Clinique Juridique in Togo at the law school. But because the emphasis is one of the things they dealt with Tessa and Tracy in the book, in narrowing, we're looking at a US based law audience where largely there is the technological availability, except we still have, I'm getting internet connection, there we go. Broadband problems in rural America, internet connectivity in low-income households in urban America. Hopefully this bipartisan infrastructure bill will deal with that, inshallah, okay? But so it's important to remember that there really is that problem we have right here at home. Doing this chapter also gave me an opportunity to explore what's been done back in 1932, the International Council for Open and Distant Education in Norway, okay? One of those progressive Scandinavian countries began correspondence courses. And to this day, they have OFDL. You all know what that acronym is, right? OFDL, Open, Flexible, and Distance Learning. There's the Open University in the UK. These are things I can share with people later in terms of web addresses and so forth. But there are resources out there for low tech. There in New York, Tracy, right next door to you, CUNY at the Borough of Manhattan Community College set up an e-learning center right at the beginning of the, I see you're nodding your head, right at the beginning of the pandemic. All kinds of wonderful low-tech resources. There's something, the field of digital pedagogy, a guy named Sean Michael Morris at seanmichaelmorris.com. 20-year veteran in instructional design, network learning, digital composition, collaboration, publishing. He dutifully undertakes his daily task of emailing his students. This is the human contact point that some of my colleagues talked about here, the one-on-one, the importance of that. When you don't have these other high-tech platforms, use the email to communicate with students. And what he does dutifully every day with me tea in hand, unbreakfasted, and usually still in my pajamas, spelling it with the British orthography, he gets on board and makes sure that he contacts those students in ways that office hours never will do, or the humane contact that we talk about having humanity law school, many of us put, in a tertiary place. I don't want to exceed my time here. Hybridpedagogy.org is another important website, hybrid being one of the bywords we've all talked about and we'll hear more about throughout the day. The importance of old school methodologies. Remember pen pals, when you had a US Postal Service that used to work, and maybe we will again. Maybe the infrastructure bill will address that. Maybe we'll get a new Postmaster General. But again, this is not going to resonate with a lot of folks, but use the letter writing, the peer-to-peer contact. What we've learned from peer mentors and peer educators, the potential of what we've seen like in other countries where kids get together. Here we're talking K-12. I think maybe Meredith or someone else referenced the K-12 experience. Maybe it was Rachel. We can learn from that. The importance of kids just getting together and talking, group collaboration, the importance of that. So when you don't have the platform of the whole class and the synchronous teaching ability, you deal more with these one-on-one abilities, face-to-face, writing letters to each other, just taking advantage of the small platforms. Most of the global south, everybody has a cell phone or a mobile phone, and they've got Facebook. And so things that are just in smaller platforms, we have to find ways to maybe translate some of the curriculum. Maybe what Susan was saying about subway learning. Tell me how I'm doing on time, Tessa, and I'll shut up if I'm going too fast.
Maybe another minute.
Okay, all right. Oh, you know what? I think the rest can kind of go into my next section. But basically, recognizing the digital natives are out there, although their platforms may not be as robust as we'd like or large as we'd like. But even apps in Tanzania, kids K-12 are learning on apps. So I'm going to mute myself again.
All right, Rachel Krosky Roberts, how about you about dealing with students with low tech or disabilities? What are your advice?
Yeah, so this is kind of right in the heart of my chapter with Queen Muirs on helping students become effective online learners in both synchronous and asynchronous environments. And I think that one of the biggest things we need to do is, Steve just mentioned digital natives. It is true that many of our students are digital natives, but even the digital natives, you have to teach how to learn online. They don't know. The more assumptions we make about what they have access to and what kinds of capabilities they have, the more likely it is we're going to leave students behind. And so the first one I'd say is do some research in advance to provide students with options if they have limited access to technology, poor technology, or no dedicated study space. So don't make students have to come to you to tell you that they have problems or that something isn't working. Assume you're going to have people with problems and provide that information up front. Otherwise, you're putting your most at-risk students in a hole from the very beginning. So, just a couple of examples. A cameras on policy, we all love seeing our students' faces, but it's likely to be really problematic for students from lower socioeconomic groups. So think through why you want cameras on. What purpose does that serve? Only require cameras on when you absolutely need them. Sorry, I feel a little passionate about this one. And I love seeing students, and I came very hesitantly to the idea of not requiring cameras on. But it requires you to be more creative in offering them alternative ways for participation. I think it was Meredith mentioned the chat function. There are all sorts of things that students can do. It was a lifesaver for students that I had who had difficult home spaces, for shy students who feared participation, for students who didn't have good bandwidth, who were literally driving around the city trying to find a Wi-Fi connection. We don't think of that in law school because we think everybody's got money. They don't, right? We have students who are significant percentages of students who are food insecure, and then we're assuming they have great access to technology. If you're going to require cameras, don't assume everyone has access to the technology to hide their backgrounds with a Zoom background. Provide them with low-tech options like a green tablecloth attached to their bathroom wall, right? Give them examples of the sorts of things so that without outing anyone, that that you've got students who are Zooming in from their bathroom floor, right? Because and by the way, if you don't know that that's happening, it's happening, right? Their closets, their bathroom floors, McDonald's, you name it, they're finding these places. On that note, do some research to find places where students can access computers if they don't have them, and places where they can access reliable internet if they don't have it in their homes, and provide that. Again, everything is upfront. Provide it in the syllabus or in some other document. Don't make someone come to you and say, I'm having these problems, because many just won't. The other thing is give students advice about structuring their study space, whether they have a dedicated study space or have to move around. So don't assume everybody has the lovely office that many of us might have. Many of them don't. They're sharing a bedroom with 2 other students, and that's their only study space, and they may need to move around. So it's helpful to actually tell them, create a travel bag that you can just pick up and go, and that has, earplugs, paper, pens, sticky notes, the like, so that they can, that low-tech survival package that they can take with them. And then finally, and I don't want to take up too much more time, but don't assume, and I think this responds a little bit to the question about students with ADHD, don't assume that students will know how to manage their materials in the online environment just because they're digital natives. Many are going to try to read an online textbook, take notes, watch you and shop for shoes all on the same screen, and then wonder why they aren't keeping up, right? Or can't track. And this can happen with any student, let alone your ADHD students, students with ADHD. So, give them specific advice about pulling things off the screen, whether it's taking notes by hand, whether it's using if they can't afford a second screen, using their phone as a second screen. Of course, I know that if they don't need the phone as a second screen, the next piece of advice is almost contradictory, which is get the phone as far away from you as possible to avoid the distraction, right? But give them that advice up front, because they don't all know. It's not natural to them, even those who have grown up on computers. That's it. I think that's all I'm going to say for now.
Yeah, and I think that dovetails nice. There was a question in chat about, we're highlighting the good things about it, but yes, some of it is hard, and sometimes the technology doesn't work as we want. And I've even struggled with the 2 screens and figuring out what's on one screen and what's on another screen. Or you can talk to anyone who's taught moot court, and trying to figure out a effective timer has been lots of challenges. And some of that, I think, is where we as faculty can help each other. And I know our writing department at Arizona, we had weekly meetings, and sometimes those weekly meetings are, I need to test out this timer to see if it works, and my 3-year-old can't help me. So can you, colleagues, let me test out this timer and share my screen and see if it works. I've talked to colleagues who have older children who, get on a Zoom with their kids to test out different technological aspects. So it goes back to how, some of this is more work for us because we have to be testing out all of these things before we then implement them in the classroom and be sure they'll be effective online, that they'll be effective to our students with disabilities or who may not have good technological access. And I do think for the student with ADHD, I know I had students who said online learning was not optimal for them. And I think that's probably very true. I mean, just like the Socratic method isn't great for every student. And so I see law school and online teaching as offering more options to our students, not less, right? Not every student's going to want a fully online JD program, but some might who have, difficult schedules or a lot of caretaking responsibilities. Nyla, what is your advice for not alienating students?
Yeah, I'd echo what my fellow panelists said as well. For me, partly it was, setting up sort of expectations. So I put into my syllabus, like, people are going to lose Wi-Fi connection. It's going to drop. It's going to pause. You may not be able to hear me. Don't panic. Like, this is going to happen to all of us. It doesn't, you're not going to fail the class, if you, do your best to get back in, whatever, just sort of setting up expectations that yes, there will be problems. Nothing is going to be perfect here. This is, so I think that was sort of helpful in just sort of naming it a little bit. For me, I thought most of my classes were synchronous, or let's see, they were all synchronous, but I would mix in some asynchronous elements. And so I felt like students really appreciated the flexibility. So, whether it was sort of around a time when they had other exams going on or whatever it was going on in the schedule, and I would sort of say, okay, instead of this synchronous class, there's an asynchronous assignment. You have until X date to complete it, but it just gave them some flexibility. They could sort of move their schedule around a little bit. And I felt like that takes off some of the stress. They can catch up with things. They can time it a little bit better. So I think that's helpful to the extent, the more we can do that, I think the better. When I did do a timed quiz or exam, I spent a lot of time talking about it, showing them demos, like really walking through everything, giving them an assignment to like do a practice question beforehand. Again, there's just a lot of, leading up to getting them prepared, trying to help with the inevitable, fear that was going to come up. I just thought, and sort of, well, I guess this is sort of related, sort of not, but, being able to kind of pivot, like, if the class had just finished a midterm and I didn't know about it for some reason, and they come in and they're just, just drained, what can we do to work with that? What is that going to look like? Or there were times we had a tornado at one point, like everybody's internet was going out. There were just, there's things going on where this isn't going to work. So how can we just sort of take that in stride, figure out a different approach to get to the material? And just sort of be a little bit more flexible, be a little bit more responsive. And there's something about being in the classroom that doesn't lend itself to that. I think when I'm in the classroom, yes, things will change up a little bit, but it's like we are there for that time period in that space, and I have my lesson plan and I have my slides or whatever. And so something about being online felt more like, okay, let's just switch gears. We need to do something different. If even briefly, right? So, yeah, so I guess just sort of overall flexibility and, anticipating that things won't be perfect and being able to roll with that and letting them know that you don't expect them, their connections, their environments to be perfect and flawless, right? That you understand that. So, thanks.
Yeah, I love Susan's comment in the chat, and I don't know if everyone can see this or just the panelists, but she has a you need help module in her online course that lists all the resources available. And I think sometimes for law schools that are part of a larger university, we might forget about the resources even that our broader university offers. Or perhaps it's a time to have a conversation at your law school about, Do we have hotspots available for students? Do we have laptops that they can loan? At Arizona, we have a lot of students who live on the Navajo reservation and may not have great internet access there up in the northern part of the state. And so we had hotspots available for them to get better internet access for their classes. So we have about 10 minutes left, and I have one more question. We have four panelists to speak on it, and then we may have a little bit of time for Q&A. But what do you think that legal education, oops, see, tech problems here. Now my earpods are running out of battery. What do we think legal education will look like in the next 10 years? Let's see, Rachel Krosky Roberts, why don't you start us off?
So I can tell you what I hope. I'm not sure I can tell you what I think it will look like. I hope it's not business as usual. There's such a temptation to go back to the familiar. And so I do worry about that but people were already doing online stuff. Now everybody got forced into it, right? I hope institutions and individuals spend serious time thinking about what we've learned, how we can leverage it to reinvent legal education in many ways. I don't think we should throw everything out that we've learned or that we've done in the past, but I think the best law schools in 10 years are going to be incorporating the best of what we've learned from that rapid shift online to make law school more humane, more practical, more accessible than ever before. I do think it's going to require a little bit of working with the ABA to advocate for some change to the distance learning rules and perhaps with state bars as well to be more comfortable with a wider range of educational platforms when licensing attorneys. But overall, that's my hope. There we have it in a nutshell.
Great. Susan, what do you think?
I think we all have kind of similar ideas of what we hope and envision. I think one of the things that I saw happen during the pandemic that I really hope continues on and really shifts some things within legal education more generally is I think the pandemic centered a different group of people as the experts in legal education. And what I mean by that is I'm not faculty. I run an academic success program, and the people and legal writing people, if you look at where all of these online conferences and workshops and webinars that have happened in the past year and a half, not everyone in those situations who are speaking belong to legal writing or ASP or things like that, but they were heavily dominated by people who maybe historically have been on the outside looking in or not having the same types of status as tenure track faculty. That means there's been more diversity in the voices as well. And to me, that's what I'm hoping to see more of, right? That having given people like me more of a voice in terms of showing our expertise in particular areas of legal education, hopefully that goes forward, because I think that's part of what actually diversifies legal educators, but also then starts setting up for diversifying legal education and ultimately the legal profession as well. And to me, that's at the heart of what's the most important thing. If we take anything out of this, whatever tools we use, ultimately the goal is to produce attorneys who are not only competent, but really reflect the wonderful diversity that exists within American society more generally. And anything that we do in terms of online learning or anything else really gets back to that.
Absolutely. I think that's a great point. Steve, what about you? What do you think law school legal education will look like in 10 years?
Well, I know there's a panel on this coming up, but I want to underscore what Susan said about diversity and breaking down those hierarchical and elitist barriers. Good luck on that. Maybe we'll have a commercial space flight before that ever happens. Oh, wait, we did. But I guess I'd break it into two categories: non-tech, meaning sort of in person in real time, and tech. Some of the things I think was one of the Rachel's or everyone has talked about what this allowed us to do is think about what we should have been doing all along. One is, can you hear me okay, internet? Okay. More mindful about the importance of peer collaboration and teamwork among students. That's what the profession is about. That's what lawyering is about. We've talked the talk on that again, not always come through in really helping to do that. Building on what's already developed, well developed, at least in this country, in terms of curricular content, experiential, clinical teaching and learning. Go forth big time. Like the Socratic method, okay, it's got its time and place. Maybe it's place still. More authentic and diverse methods of assessment. Again, lots has been written on this, talked about on this over time. We need to think about that. On the tech, more asynchronous learning, more cross-border contacts. Folks talked about this earlier. We can have students come on, we can have speakers come on, faculty collaboration going across our regions and our countries, across borders. And finally, I think an important point made in the earlier panel on the importance of learning to be creative and learning to face adversity. It won't be the same next time, as some folks said, but that should be one mantra that we can hold on to.
And Meredith, I think I have you last here for this question.
Okay, what I would really like to see is, and I think that we're going to see, is more of a recognition of, as we've talked about a little bit, as online learning as kind of its own pedagogy. Because I think that for many schools have been engaged in online learning for years and have been doing this very well, but I think that there are some schools that are newer to this, that have been viewing online education more as kind of a moneymaker. We can have asynchronous courses and courses in a box. And I think this shift during the pandemic demonstrated that online teaching is its own pedagogy, and we have to really pay attention to the needs of our students, and student engagement isn't always the same, so you have to adjust. And I do think that that flexibility and the access are great things that we're going to take with us moving into the law school of the future. But I also think that a recognition now of online learning as its own thing, as it's something that is really can be a really, really wonderful thing, but you have to learn how to teach that way, just like we had to learn how to teach in person. And I think that is going to be one of the biggest things that we're going to take going into the future.